Hi, sixth graders. This is Mrs. Kalen. I'm here to present your library lesson for this week. We're going to be doing something that we would be doing anyway, even if we were at school. And I'm really excited that we have the opportunity to do this from home. Many of you remember in past years, as long as you've been at High Point, Mrs. Neville has done a lot of wonderful activities with you for Poetry Month. And it's April, so it's Poetry Month, and we are going to be spending the next couple of weeks doing some poetry-related activities together. I'm going to find some ways to make them interactive and fun and show you different types of poems that you might not have gotten to experience before. So today what we're going to do is we're going to read from two different books. And I'm going to share some poems with you that are poems that tell stories. So when you think about poems, you might think about poems that rhyme, poems that are sort of these short snippets that are very either the types of like funny rhyming poems like Shel Silverstein and I'm Just No Good at Rhyming, and books that you might have experienced at school before or on your own. Or then other poems that are very maybe abstract and full of emotion. And we're going to be looking at something a little bit different today, which are poems that tell stories. Poetry is not usually the way that you think of storytelling happening. You think of a novel or you think of a short story, which are written in prose, which in writing terms is kind of the opposite of poetry. Prose is writing that is not poetry. But there are a number of wonderful stories that use poetry to convey a plot, to have a beginning, middle, and end, that have characters, that have action. And we're going to read two examples of these today that I want to ask you the question before we start reading, why? Why would the author use poetry? Why would they tell these stories with this kind of language, with this kind of format, rather than just in a traditional prose storytelling format? So that's the question for you as we read these two stories. One is a novel in verse, which is a type of novel that is written like a poem. This is a book, I believe I might have mentioned this to you guys before. This is a book that won a Newbery Honor this year called Other Words for Home. And recently, in the last few years, there have been a few really wonderful books that have been novels in verse. You might think of some of the books by Jason Reynolds. You might have read some of those. You might think of a book like Listen Slowly. These are other books that are written in that verse format. So Brown Girl Dreaming is a memoir that's written in verse. So this book, Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga, is the story of a girl named Jude who is, as the story begins, living in Syria, all the way halfway across the world, in the Middle East, a country that in the last few years has been a place of a lot of conflict and war. As the story begins, Jude and her family are living in sort of a quiet seaside town that's like a town where a lot of tourists come. She has a good life. She is close with her cousins and her friends and her family. And as war and conflict come to her town, her family needs to make a change, and she and her mother move to the United States to live with an uncle. So what I'm going to do is read you two of the first chapters of this story, and I want you to listen to the language, because we are reading poetry. I'm going to show you this looks different than the pages of a traditional novel. And I want you to listen, because it's not written in rhyme. It's not written in a way that you might think of a poem sounding. It's not quite as abstract as some, but it does sound different than regular prose writing. So I'm going to read you 2 chapters from this. The chapters are about a page and a half each. And then I'm going to read you another poem from a different kind of poetic story. Okay? This is chapter 1. It is almost summer, and everywhere smells like fish, except for right by the sea, where you have to hold your nose just right, and you can smell the sprawling jasmine in the salt water instead. In summer, I always hold my nose to avoid the stench of fish and tourists that smell like hairspray and money and French perfume. The tourists come from Damascus and Aleppo, sometimes even from Beirut and Amman. Once I met a man all the way from Doha. I asked him about the big skyscrapers that I had heard reach all the way up to the heavens, but Baba asked me to hush before the man could answer me. Baba does not like for me to talk to tourists, strangers, men. He does not want me to talk to anyone that I don't know, even people that I do know. He always says, Jude, sketty. So I bite my tongue, and sometimes it tastes even worse than the way summer fish smell. Everyone is saying that there will be fewer visitors from Aleppo this year, that no one is left Aleppo, that no one is left in Aleppo to come, that everyone who could leave Aleppo already has. When I ask Mama if this is true, she says, Jude, sketty. Remember that means hold your tongue. I'm going to read you one more of these poem chapters. This is chapter 2. Our city does not look like what they show on TV of Syria. I remember the first time Fatima and I saw a story about Aleppo on the news. We felt proud. I know that it was strange to say, childish maybe. It felt strange even then, but it felt like the rest of the world saw me. But our city does not look like Aleppo, before or after. It is not sprawling and noisy with buildings pressed up against one another like they are crammed together in an elevator with no room to breathe. Our city is on the sea. It sits below the mountains. It is where the rest of Syria comes when they want to breathe. No one is going to come this year, Fatima says. I wonder if that is because there is no one left who needs to breathe. So we heard a little bit of an example this way of the story. I want to hear from you. You can just sort of tell me right now as you're listening. Think about how this feels different from the beginning of any other novel that you might open up and start to read. I am going to read one more chapter from this in just a minute, but I wanted to take a pause. And did you hear differences in the language? Did you hear me pause as I was reading these lines? Or did it just sound like the beginning of any other story to you? Think about that. Why do you think this author might have chosen to write this way? Why not just write it in that she's writing in first person. She's telling her own story or the character story. But what do you think poetry adds to this story? I'm going to read one more. Fatima and I almost always have our asronaya together. Either Mama makes it or Auntie Amal. Fatima likes to have olives, green and black, so fat you can stick your fingers inside of them and eat them one by one. I think olives taste like the sea, and all that salt makes me dizzy. I eat the jibna and the bread that Mama gets from Hibba's bakery around the corner because she knows it's my favorite. Hibba makes bread as fluffy as a pillow. I eat so much of it that Mama always has to remind me that Asranaya is supposed to help me last until dinner, but it is not dinner. During Asranaya, we drink tea. Or Fatima drinks tea, and I drink sugar with mint and a side of tea. We watch old American movies that we bought with our Eid money and birthday money. We watch Julia Roberts fall in love, and we watch Sandra Bullock track down criminals and Reese Witherspoon go to law school. Fatima and I both want to be movie stars. Fatima also wants to be a doctor, but I only want to be a movie star. The wanting pulses so hard in my chest that it sometimes hurts. My older brother, Isa, used to watch the movies with us. He would sometimes even act them out with us, standing up on the couch, imitating Reese's way of speaking English, all slow and sugary. He used to, until one day, Baba came down from work early and walked in on us, acting out in the movies. Baba didn't say anything. Not even Jude, Sketty. He didn't even look at me. Only at Isa. He shook his head and walked into his bedroom. So you can think about what we know about these characters already. There's not much description, but there's of visuals, but there's a lot of description in the poetry of sound, smell, and action, right? The way that her father looks, the way that the sea smells, the way that something tastes. So this is a sample. So if you would like to read more of this book, I really recommend it. You really just to give you a little bit more of a preview of what happens. Jude and her mother, on their own, go to live with their uncle, her mother's brother, in Cleveland, and she has to start life as a student at an American middle school, and is separated from her family and is sort of caught in between two cultures. So I highly recommend this if you would like to read more and get a feeling for that type of novel in verse. So I'm going to read you now. I'm going to show you a different book. This is a totally different book. This is a book called Good Masters, Sweet Ladies, Voices from a Medieval Village. And this is a book that actually won the Newbery Medal about 10 years ago, I believe. And is, I'm sure this won the Newbery Medal before I was even a librarian, but I am sure every once in a while, there's sort of a real surprise in the book that wins the Newbery. Like this year when a graphic novel won. This is a book of poetry, but it's a book of poetry that tells a story. And this book, I believe, is very much inspired by a very famous book called The Canterbury Tales, which is something that, like, if you go to college and you study English, you will probably read parts, at least, of The Canterbury Tales. It's one of the oldest books in English that we know of. It's written in a very, very different sounding Old English. And it is a number of stories that are put together that are different people's tales of a pilgrimage in England many hundreds of years ago. So what this book is it's modern, it's written now, but it takes different characters that you would find in a medieval village. In this case, mostly kids and young people, teenagers. And the author writes these stories that are poems telling about their different experiences. So you have a doctor's son, you have a girl who's a shepherdess, you have all of these different people in the village, a young boy out on a hunt, and you hear their voices through poetry. And interspersed throughout these poems, you have a poem like this that tells, this is the pilgrim story, but you also have these background chapters that really explain, this is all there. You have the pilgrim story, and then you have the background of what a medieval pilgrimage, these trips that people went on to visit religious holy sites. You have these chapters that really give you the background. So you have the people telling the story in poetry and this nonfiction element as well. So the other book, this is an example of storytelling in a modern sense and in giving you the experience of a very personal and very modern story. And this is an example of storytelling poetry giving you a little bit of insight into history. So I'm going to read one of these. I'm actually going to read you the first poem, and you even have like The book has this really, really cool detailed illustrations. You have like a whole map of the village here. And it's a setting, a medieval manor, England, 1255. So we're going back a long time here. This is long before sort of what we think of when you think of like old-fashioned times in England. We're going way, way back. This is before Shakespeare. This is before most of the like kings and queens that you think about. Before Elizabeth I. This is way before. This is hundreds of years, 300 years before Shakespeare was writing. Life was difficult and very, very different from what we know. So let's hear the way a poet can express history. This is the first character who's introduced in the story. Hugo, the Lord's nephew. So this is the Lord of the manor, somebody of high status. His nephew is telling the story. So a young boy. The Feast of All Souls, I ran away from my tutor. Latin and grammar, no wonder. I ran into the woods where I saw his tracks. This big, the mud scratched bottom side from the trees. Followed his friend straight into his bed and found it warm. There was a boar in the forest. When I went back, there was my uncle, rod in hand, but he didn't strike. I told him, there's a boar in the forest. Why, then we'll go hunting. And as for you, you'll hunt like a man or be flogged like a boy. Help kill the boar, and I'll give you the kidneys. Turn tail, and I'll have the skin off your back. That night I lay and dreamed of the hunt. The underbrush stirring, the snort of the boar, its foul mouth foaming, its tusks like scimitars. Those tusks can slice a man, groin to gorge. But that's not the worst. The man that dies from the wound of a boar loses his soul and burns in hell. Dawn came. We mounted. Long before noon, the dogs caught the scent and the hunt was on. 2 relays of hounds, squealing most sore. The third was faint with fatigue. I could smell my sweat, rank with fear, and then it was like my dream. The underbrush moved. The sticks shattered. I saw it, bristling, dark as the devil, huge as a horse. My bowels turned to water. My uncle dismounted, and I did the same. My legs were like straw, but I walked. Mouth dry, palms wet, one hand forward on the spear and 1 foot ahead. To fall would be death. It charged. My uncle lunged, and I lunged behind him. Thrust. Felt my spear pierce, braced myself, end to armpit, and shoved. It took a long time. The dogs keening, the boar struggling. Blood on the grass, but I stood my ground. At last it was over. The brute lay still. I almost wept. The joy of it, the terror. I gasped like a fish, let my head fall back. The green leaves swam in the sky. He kept his word. Right there in the wood, we kindled a fire and butchered the boar. The kidneys were mine, gleaming with fat. He clapped my back and called me a man. But in the dark of the night, I hear that sound. Sweat in my sleep, my spear slips through my hand. I dream that I am back in the wood with the boar. So that's the first chapter, the first character we meet. And again, I want to ask you, why do you think the author chose to write this in poetry? She could have just written a story about, medieval characters all getting along together or working together, a sort of end-to-end story. Why poetry? I want you to think about that. But one idea that strikes me that I wanted to share is just that when you think about these 2 books, very different stories, different time periods, different cultures, they're both stories that take us someplace very different. One is a travel in time, one is a travel in place. And I think the author really wants to get a sense of that. And one way to do it is through, detailed descriptive prose, non-poetic language, and the other is through poetry, which really gets to your senses. Rather than necessarily describing a place, it might make you feel what it's like to be there. The scent, that feeling inside a person, the emotion, can bring you to another time and place. So I'm going to leave you with that. If you would like to read more, both of these books are books that you can find ebooks of online, or listen to audiobooks, or even order if you want to read them on your own. And next week, we will do a little bit of playing around with some nonsense poetry and invented words and poetry. So I hope everybody has a great week. And I will talk to you soon. Please write to me if you need recommendations for books or anything else. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks, 6th graders.